Jimin, don't close your eyes. Look at me. Suga's voice broke through the dressing room, which only seconds earlier had been filled with the sound of celebration. Jimin lay motionless on the floor, his face pale and his breathing faint, while the hallway lights flickered beyond the open door. Suga held his hand tightly, calling his name again and again, as if he feared that even 1 second might make Jimin drift farther away. But when a staff member whispered, "Suga, there's something you need to know," his expression suddenly changed. What had really happened before Jimin collapsed? And why did Suga suddenly feel that this was somehow his fault? If you were in Suga's position, would you have done the same thing? 3 hours earlier, the arena had been alive with light. Thousands of army filled the seats, their purple light sticks moving like waves beneath the ceiling as the final notes of the concert echoed through the massive venue. On stage, Jimin had smiled toward the crowd, bowing deeply before stepping back beside the other members. From the audience, everything looked perfect. The lights were bright, the music was flawless, and the members appeared stronger than ever. But behind that polished performance, something had been quietly changing. Suga had noticed it first. During the final part of the concert, Jimin's smile seemed slightly slower to appear. His movements were still precise, but there were moments when he briefly lowered his head and took a deeper breath than usual. Suga watched him from across the stage without saying anything. Years of performing together had taught him to recognize small changes that cameras could easily miss. When the final song ended, Jimin turned toward the crowd and smiled again, forcing his voice to remain steady as he thanked everyone for being there. The audience responded with a deafening roar. Jimin waved, bowed once more, and disappeared backstage with the others. The moment he crossed the curtain, however, his expression changed. "You okay?" Suga asked quietly. Jimin looked at him and gave a small smile. "Yeah, just tired." Suga studied his face for another second. "You sure?" Jimin nodded. "I'm fine." Those 2 words sounded ordinary, but neither of them knew that within the next few minutes, they would become the last normal conversation they had that night. The backstage corridor was almost unnaturally quiet compared with the arena outside. The roar of the crowd had become a distant vibration behind thick concrete walls, replaced by the hurried footsteps of staff, the rolling sound of equipment cases, and the occasional crackle of a radio. Jimin walked slowly toward the dressing room, still wearing his stage clothes, his jacket hanging loosely from his shoulders. He smiled whenever a staff member passed him, nodded when someone congratulated him, and thanked the musicians who had gathered near the hallway. To anyone watching, he looked completely normal, but Suga remained a few steps behind him, watching carefully. "You're walking slower than usual," Suga said. Jimin glanced over his shoulder. "Am I?" "Yes." Jimin gave a quiet laugh. "Maybe you're just walking too fast." Suga didn't laugh. "Jimin." The smile on Jimin's face faded for a moment. "I said I'm okay." Suga stopped walking. He knew that tone. It wasn't anger. It was the tone Jimin used when he didn't want someone to look too closely. Before Suga could ask anything else, Jimin turned toward the dressing room door. Inside, Jungkook was already removing his in-ear monitors while J-Hope was talking excitedly about one of the performances. Jin was laughing with a member of the production crew, while RM stood near a table reviewing something with their manager. V leaned against the wall, quietly scrolling through his phone. The atmosphere should have felt relaxed after the concert, but Jimin remained unusually quiet. He placed his microphone carefully on the table and began removing his accessories one by one. First the earpiece, then a bracelet, then the small ring he had worn throughout the performance. His fingers paused over the ring for several seconds. Suga noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked. Jimin looked down. "Nothing. You're doing it again." Jimin looked up. "Doing what?" Pretending nothing is wrong. For a moment, neither spoke. The others continued talking in the background, unaware of the conversation happening only a few feet away. Jimin finally exhaled. "I just don't want a night to end with everyone worrying about me." Suga's expression softened. "Nobody is asking you to carry everyone." Jimin smiled faintly. "Sometimes it feels like that's what I have to do." The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the noise around them. Suga heard them anyway. He stepped closer. "You don't!" Jimin looked at him, but before he could answer, a staff member entered the room carrying several bottles of water. Jimin thanked her and took one, but instead of drinking, he simply held it between both hands. His fingers were trembling slightly. Suga saw it immediately. "Jimin!" "I'm fine," Jimin repeated. This time, Suga didn't argue. He simply stayed nearby. A few minutes later, the other members began preparing to leave the dressing room. The plan was simple. Shower, change, gather their belongings, then meet briefly with the production team before leaving the venue. It should have been an ordinary post-concert routine, but Jimin moved through it as though every small task required more concentration than usual. When he bent down to pick up his bag, he stopped halfway and placed one hand against the table. Jungkook noticed. "Hi, Young." Jimin straightened quickly. "I'm okay." Jungkook frowned but said nothing. RM looked over from across the room. "Should we give you a few minutes?" Jimin shook his head. "No, really, I'm just tired." The word kept returning, tired. It became a shield behind which Jimin could hide everything he didn't want the others to see. Yet there was something else behind his exhaustion, something that had nothing to do with the concert itself. Earlier that evening, before walking onto the stage, Jimin had received a message that he had never mentioned to anyone. It wasn't dramatic. There had been no frightening headline, no emergency call, nothing that would immediately make someone understand why he had gone quiet. It was simply a message from someone connected to a small group of young performers who had been working with the concert production team. One of them, a 19-year-old backup musician named Minnie, had been struggling for months after his family's financial situation forced him to consider abandoning music altogether. Jimin had met him during rehearsals and had noticed something unusual about him. Minnie never complained. Even when equipment malfunctioned or rehearsals ran late, he stayed behind and helped others pack. He reminded Jimin of people he had known before fame changed his life. Earlier that afternoon, Minnie had quietly told Jimin that he might not be able to continue. His family needed money, and he had been offered a full-time job outside music. Jimin had listened without interrupting. Before they separated, Minnie had said, "I don't think I'm good enough to keep doing this." Those words had stayed with Jimin throughout the concert. He had performed beneath thousands of lights while thinking about someone standing backstage, wondering whether his dream was already over. Jimin had wanted to speak to him after the show, but the schedule had moved too quickly. Then, just before the final performance, Jimin received another message. Minnie had written only one sentence. "Thank you for believing in me, even if I can't do this anymore." Jimin had read it once, locked his phone, and walked onto the stage. He never told Suga. He never told the other members. And perhaps that was the real reason his smile had looked different that night. It wasn't simply physical exhaustion. It was the weight of knowing that someone had quietly decided to give up on something they loved. Jimin understood that feeling more deeply than he wanted to admit. As the dressing room slowly emptied, Suga noticed Jimin staring at his phone. "Who is it?" he asked. Jimin hesitated. "Someone I met during rehearsals." "Is everything okay?" Jimin looked toward the door. "I don't know." Suga waited. "He thinks he has to give up." Suga's eyes narrowed slightly. "Give up what?" "Music." There was a long silence. Jimin finally sat down on the edge of the sofa. "He's young, he works hard, he doesn't ask for anything. But he thinks because life got difficult, his dream has to disappear too." Suga leaned against the table. "And you think you can fix that?" Jimin looked down at his hands. "No, I just want him to know that giving up doesn't mean he failed." Suga understood the deeper meaning immediately. He had heard that kind of sentence before, not from Jimin, but from himself. There were moments when every artist wondered whether the thing they had spent years building was still worth the exhaustion, criticism, fear, and uncertainty that came with it. "Then talk to him," Suga said, "but don't carry his life for him." Jimin looked up. "I know." "Do you?" Jimin didn't answer. Suga sighed softly. "You always do this. You see someone hurting and immediately decide their pain belongs to you too." Jimin gave a small smile. "Maybe that's not always a bad thing. It is when you forget you're human." That sentence stayed between them. Jimin looked away. For the first time that night, his eyes seemed tired in a way that had nothing to do with the concert. Then suddenly the room tilted. Jimin blinked and reached for the edge of the sofa. Suga moved instantly. "Jimin!" "Wait," Jimin whispered. The bottle in his hand slipped onto the floor. Water spread across the polished surface. Suga grabbed his arm. "Sit down. I'm okay." "Stop saying that." Jimin tried to laugh, but the sound never came. His knees weakened. Suga caught him before he hit the floor. The room changed in an instant. The laughter disappeared. Conversation stopped. Someone called for medical staff. Jungkook rushed back through the doorway. RM immediately moved aside to clear space. J-Hope grabbed a towel and knelt nearby. Jimin's eyes were half open, but his focus was fading. "Jimin, look at me," Suga said, holding his shoulder. "Stay with me." Jimin tried to respond, but only a faint sound escaped. And in that moment, Suga realized something that frightened him more than the collapse itself. Jimin hadn't suddenly become weak. He had been trying to hide how much he was struggling for hours. Suga looked at the scattered bottle, the discarded stage jacket, and Jimin's phone lying face down on the floor. Then the screen lit up. One new message appeared. Suga glanced at it without touching the phone. It was from Minnie. The message contained only a few words. "I'm sorry. I made my decision." Suga looked back at Jimin, and for the first time that night, he understood that whatever had been happening inside Jimin's mind was far bigger than anyone in that room had realized. The message remained glowing on Jimin's phone while the room filled with movement. A manager called for the medical team, Jungkook moved the nearby chairs away, and RM calmly asked everyone to give Jimin enough space to breathe. Suga never let go of Jimin's hand. "Stay with me," he repeated quietly. Jimin's eyes opened for a moment, but his expression was distant. "Minnie," he whispered. Suga leaned closer. "Don't worry about him right now. You need to focus on yourself." Jimin shook his head weakly. "He's alone. And you're not," Suga answered firmly. "Neither of you are." The medical staff arrived within moments and began checking Jimin's condition. The atmosphere was controlled, but nobody in the room could hide their fear. The concert had ended only minutes earlier, yet the same people who had been celebrating were now standing silently around a medical bag and a fallen water bottle. Jimin slowly regained enough strength to sit upright, but Suga could see that something inside him was still fighting. "I need to talk to him," Jimin said. "Not now," the manager replied gently. "Later." Jimin looked toward Suga. "If I don't talk to him tonight, he might think nobody cares." Suga's expression tightened. "And if you keep pushing yourself tonight, what happens to you?" Jimin had no answer. The question landed harder than anyone expected. For years, Jimin had been surrounded by people who cared about him, yet he had somehow learned to hide his own struggles behind a smile. He could recognize exhaustion in another person within seconds, but when it came to himself, he always seemed to need permission to stop. Suga understood that contradiction. He had seen it countless times, in rehearsals, backstage, during long flights, and in the quiet minutes after performances when the cameras were gone. Jimin always asked whether everyone else was okay before asking himself. That night, however, Suga refused to let him do it again. "You're staying here," Suga said. "I'm going to talk to Minnie." Jimin immediately shook his head. "No, he needs me." "Then I'll tell him you're resting." "Suga, no." The word was quiet but absolute. Jimin stared at him. Suga rarely raised his voice, but when he became serious, there was no room for argument. "You don't have to save everyone tonight," he said. "Let someone take care of you." Jimin looked down and his eyes became wet. He quickly turned his face away so nobody would notice. But Suga noticed. He always did. Across the room, Jungkook stood silently, watching the two of them. He had heard enough to understand that the collapse wasn't simply about physical exhaustion. RM approached him and whispered, "Give them a moment." Jungkook nodded, but before leaving, he placed Jimin's jacket beside him. "You forgot this," he said softly. Jimin looked at the jacket and gave him a small smile. "Thanks." Jungkook nodded and walked away. It was a tiny gesture, almost meaningless on the surface. But Jimin stared at the jacket for several seconds as if the familiar object had reminded him that he wasn't alone. Meanwhile, Suga stepped into the hallway and found Minnie sitting on a metal equipment case near the loading area. The young musician was still wearing his concert clothes, but his instrument case rested beside him untouched. He looked exhausted. When he saw Suga approaching, he immediately stood. "Is Jimin okay?" Suga didn't answer immediately. He looked at the young man carefully. "He collapsed." Minnie's face changed. "What? He's conscious now." Minnie lowered his head. "This is my fault." Suga's expression hardened. "Don't say that. He was worried because of me. You didn't make him collapse. But you didn't." Suga sat down beside him. For several seconds, neither spoke. The arena above them was still buzzing with people leaving, but down in the service corridor, the world felt strangely distant. Minnie finally whispered, "I sent him a message before the last song." "I saw it." Minnie looked frightened. "You saw it," Suga nodded. "You said you made your decision." Minnie swallowed hard. "I have to leave music. My mother needs help. My younger sister is starting school. I can't keep pretending this is enough." Suga looked at the instrument case. "So you think quitting means you're choosing your family? Isn't it? Maybe, but don't confuse changing direction with failing." Minnie looked at him. "Easy for you to say." Suga didn't become defensive. Instead, he nodded. "You're right." Minnie seemed surprised. "It is easier for me to say. I've been lucky enough to have people around me who kept telling me to continue when I wanted to stop. But that doesn't mean I know what your life should look like." He paused. Only you can decide that. Minnie wiped his eyes quickly. Then why did Jimin care so much? Suga looked toward the closed dressing room door. Because that's who he is. I don't want him to think he has to save me. Then don't ask him to. Minnie nodded slowly. What should I do? Suga looked at him for a long moment. Go home tonight, talk to your family, don't make a permanent decision while you're exhausted and scared. Minnie stared at the floor. And Jimin? He needs rest. Can I see him? Suga hesitated. Inside the dressing room, Jimin was sitting quietly while the medical staff monitored him. His breathing had stabilized, but his face remained pale. Suga knew Jimin would want Minnie there. He also knew that the young musician might blame himself if he saw Jimin in that condition. Not yet, Suga said, but tomorrow, if Jimin wants to talk to you, he'll find a way. Minnie nodded. Then he whispered something that made Suga look at him differently. I wasn't going to quit because I hated music. Suga waited. I was going to quit because I thought nobody would notice. Suga's eyes softened. Someone noticed. Minnie looked toward the dressing room. Yeah. And now you have to decide what you're going to do with that. Back inside, Jimin heard the door open. He looked up immediately. Where is he? Suga walked toward him. He's safe. Jimin exhaled. Did he say anything? He said he thought nobody would notice if he disappeared from music. Jimin lowered his eyes. I know that feeling. Suga sat beside him. I know. For several seconds, they simply sat there. No cameras, no fans, no stage lights. Just two people sitting in a quiet room after a night that had gone completely differently from what anyone had expected. Then Jimin whispered, I'm sorry. Suga frowned. For what? For making you scared. Suga looked at him. You didn't make me scared. Jimin gave him a confused expression. Suga continued, I was scared because I realized I almost missed what you were trying to tell me. Jimin looked down. His fingers tightened around the sleeve of his jacket. I didn't want anyone to worry. That's exactly why you should have told someone. Jimin's eyes filled again. This time he didn't turn away. Suga reached over and gently squeezed his shoulder. You don't have to be strong every second. The words were simple, but Jimin finally let out a shaky breath. Outside the room, the other members had gathered quietly. Nobody entered. They understood that this moment belonged to Jimin and Suga. RM stood with his arms folded, staring at the floor. J-Hope held a bottle of water in both hands. Jin had stopped joking completely. V quietly sent a message to the manager asking whether they could rearrange the next day's schedule. Jungkook stood closest to the door, listening without trying to intrude. They had all spent years learning how to perform together, but moments like this reminded them that being together meant something different when the lights disappeared. A few minutes later, Jimin looked toward Suga and whispered, Can you promise me something? What? If I ever do this again, Suga interrupted. I won't let you. Jimin almost smiled. You didn't even let me finish. I know what you're going to say. Jimin looked at him for a moment before finally smiling faintly. Then promise me, Suga nodded. I promise. But neither of them realized that the night was not over yet. Because while the medical staff prepared to move Jimin somewhere quieter for observation, another message arrived on the manager's phone, one that connected Minnie's situation to something much larger than anyone in that dressing room had imagined. And when Suga saw the manager's expression change, he knew immediately that whatever happened next would force them to make a decision none of them had prepared for. The manager stood frozen beside the doorway, staring at the message on his phone as though he was afraid to read it a second time. Suga noticed immediately. What happened? The manager hesitated before looking toward Jimin. There's something about Minnie. Jimin slowly lifted his head. What? The manager walked closer and lowered his voice. His mother was taken to the hospital earlier tonight. He didn't tell anyone because he was afraid it would affect the performance. The room went silent. Jimin's expression changed completely. Suddenly, the pieces began connecting, the exhaustion in Minnie's eyes during rehearsal, the message about giving up music, the way he had disappeared after the concert. Jimin looked at Suga. Why didn't he tell us? Suga answered quietly. Because some people become so used to protecting everyone else that they forget they're allowed to ask for help. Jimin closed his eyes for a moment. The medical staff had advised him to rest, but now he was already trying to sit up. I need to see him. Suga immediately placed a hand on his shoulder. You're not going anywhere until they say you can. But his mother, and you're still recovering. Jimin looked frustrated. Suga, please. Suga stared back at him. No, this time listen to me. The firmness in his voice made Jimin stop. Suga crouched beside him and spoke more quietly. You think helping someone means physically being there every second. It doesn't. Sometimes helping means making sure you don't become another person they have to worry about. Jimin's eyes softened. He knew Suga was right, but accepting it was harder than hearing it. Outside the room, RM had already started coordinating with the staff. Jin offered to arrange transportation for Minnie's family. J-Hope contacted a trusted member of the production team who could accompany Minnie to the hospital. Jungkook quietly asked whether they could send food and water. V stayed near the hallway, keeping curious staff and unnecessary visitors away. Nobody made a dramatic announcement. Nobody treated the situation like a heroic moment. They simply began helping, one small action at a time. That was what made it feel real. Jimin watched from the sofa, his eyes following each movement. They didn't even have to think about it, he whispered. Suga looked toward the others. That's what happens when people care. Jimin smiled faintly. I wish I could do more. You already did. I only talked to him. Sometimes that's enough to stop someone from believing they're invisible. The sentence silenced Jimin. A few minutes later, the manager returned with another update. Minnie's mother was stable, but the family needed to stay at the hospital overnight for observation. Minnie had refused to leave the building until he knew Jimin was okay. Jimin looked toward Suga. Can I call him? Suga nodded. From here. The phone was placed on speaker, but Jimin asked everyone else to step outside. Only Suga remained. The call connected after several rings. Hello, Minnie's voice sounded small. It's me, Jimin said. There was silence on the other end. Jimin, don't apologize. Minnie took a breath. I heard what happened. I'm okay. You collapsed because of me. No, Jimin answered gently. I collapsed because I pushed myself too far. That's on me. Minnie said nothing. Jimin continued, but I need you to promise me something. What? Don't make your decision tonight. Minnie's voice trembled. I don't know what to do. Then you don't have to know tonight. Jimin looked at Suga. Suga remained silent, but his expression told Jimin to keep going. Go be with your mother, go home, sleep, talk to your family. Tomorrow, if music still feels impossible, then we'll talk about another path. Another path? Yes. Jimin smiled faintly. Your dream doesn't have to disappear just because your life changes. Minnie began crying quietly. Why do you care this much? Jimin looked down at his hands. Because someone once told me that sometimes the hardest part isn't becoming successful. It's believing you're allowed to keep trying when things don't work out. Suga watched him carefully. Jimin paused. And because I know what it feels like to be surrounded by people and still feel alone. Minnie's breathing became uneven. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Jimin said softly. Just promise me you'll give yourself one more day before making a decision. I promise. The call ended. Jimin stared at the dark screen. Suga sat beside him. You okay? Jimin nodded. Yeah. Then he whispered, I think I finally understand something. What? I always thought helping someone meant making their pain disappear. Suga waited. Maybe it means staying beside them while they figure out how to carry it. Suga smiled slightly. Now you're learning. Jimin looked at him. From you? Unfortunately. Jimin laughed softly for the first time since collapsing. The sound was quiet, but it changed the room. Yet Suga's relief lasted only a moment. He looked at Jimin's face and noticed the exhaustion returning. You're done for tonight. Jimin nodded. This time he didn't argue. As the staff prepared a quieter room for him to rest, the other members returned one by one. Nobody asked too many questions. Jin simply placed a warm drink on the table. J-Hope adjusted the blanket over Jimin's shoulders. Jungkook sat nearby without saying anything. RM told him the next day's schedule would be changed. V smiled and said, You don't have to worry about anything outside this room. Jimin looked around at them. You guys, he couldn't finish the sentence. Jin immediately interrupted with a small grin. Don't make it emotional, I'm tired. Everyone laughed softly. Even Suga smiled. For a few minutes the tension finally eased, but when everyone began leaving, Jimin quietly called Suga back. Can you stay a little longer? Suga nodded. The door closed. The room became silent again. Jimin leaned back against the sofa and stared at the ceiling. I thought I was okay, he whispered. I know. I really thought I was. Suga sat across from him. Sometimes knowing you're tired isn't the same as allowing yourself to stop. Jimin turned toward him. Were you ever like that? Suga smiled without humor. More times than I can count. Then how did you stop? Suga looked toward the window. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly across the night. I didn't not by myself. Jimin listened. Someone eventually made me understand that being strong isn't the same as being alone. Jimin's eyes became wet again. Who? Suga looked back at him. People who stayed. The words settled heavily between them. Jimin looked down, then slowly reached for his phone. He opened the message from Minnie again. This time he didn't reply. He simply locked the screen and placed the phone on the table. "Tomorrow," he said. Suga nodded. "Tomorrow." Neither knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time that night, Jimin was no longer trying to solve everything before sunrise. And Suga, watching his friend finally close his eyes without pretending to be fine, realized that perhaps the real turning point had never been Jimin's collapse. It was the moment Jimin finally allowed someone else to stand beside him. The dressing room had finally become quiet. Bright backstage lights had been dimmed, leaving only a soft glow across the mirrors and the scattered traces of the concert that had ended hours earlier. A pair of stage shoes rested beneath a chair. Jimin's jacket was folded neatly beside him. The bottle of water that had fallen earlier had been replaced, but a faint mark remained on the floor, an almost invisible reminder of how quickly the night had changed. Jimin sat near the window with a blanket around his shoulders, watching the city beyond the glass. Suga remained across from him, sitting silently in a chair. Neither felt the need to fill the silence. For once, there was nothing that needed to be explained to an audience. No cameras were recording. No one was waiting for a perfect smile. After several minutes, Jimin finally spoke. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if we stopped?" Suga looked at him. "Stopped what?" "Everything." Suga leaned back. "Performing?" Jimin shook his head. "Being strong." The question lingered. Suga looked down at his hands before answering. "Sometimes." Jimin gave a faint smile. "What do you imagine?" "A quiet room." Jimin laughed softly. "That's it. A quiet room is underrated." Jimin turned toward the window again. "I think I'd be scared." "Why?" "Because if I stop moving, I might finally hear everything I've been avoiding." Suga didn't respond immediately. He understood. There were emotions that could be buried beneath rehearsals, recordings, flights, interviews, performances, and endless schedules. As long as the next task was waiting, there was always an excuse not to stop. But once the noise disappeared, the thoughts remained. Jimin rubbed his hands together beneath the blanket. "Tonight, when I was on stage, everyone looked so happy." "They were. I was happy too." He paused. "But then I saw Minnie before the last song." Suga nodded. He looked like someone who had already said goodbye to something. Jimin's voice became quieter. "I couldn't stop thinking about him." Suga looked at him. "That's not your responsibility." "I know. Do you?" Jimin smiled sadly. "I'm trying." Suga stood and walked toward the window. He didn't sit beside Jimin. Instead, he leaned against the wall a few feet away. "You know what scares me?" Jimin asked. "What?" "That one day someone I care about will disappear quietly, and I'll only realize afterward that they needed help." Suga's expression softened. "That's why you pay attention." "Maybe I pay too much attention." "Maybe." Jimin looked up. "And you? What about me? You always notice when I'm struggling." Suga was quiet. "How? You just do." Suga looked at him for a long moment. "Because you're not as good at hiding it as you think." Jimin laughed. "I thought I was." "You are." Jimin smiled. "How did you know?" Suga answered simply. "Because I know you." There was no dramatic music, no grand speech, just those 3 words, but Jimin looked down as though they carried more weight than anything else he had heard that night. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. Suga frowned. "Stop apologizing. I scared you." "Yes." Jimin looked surprised by the honesty. Suga continued, "You scared me, but being scared isn't something you need to apologize for." Jimin swallowed hard. "When you grabbed me earlier." He paused. "For a second, I thought I was going to disappoint everyone." Suga's eyes narrowed. "You collapsed and your first thought was whether you disappointed us." Jimin nodded slowly. "That's the problem." Suga moved closer and sat beside him. "Listen to me." Jimin looked at him. "You don't owe us a performance when the stage is gone." Jimin's eyes filled with tears. He tried to blink them away. Suga noticed but didn't mention them. Instead, he looked toward the folded jacket. "Remember when we used to finish rehearsals and complain about being hungry?" Jimin laughed through the tears. "You complained more than everyone." "That's not true." "It is. I was objectively hungry." Jimin laughed again. The sound was warmer this time. For a few seconds, they were no longer 2 performers surrounded by schedules and expectations. They were simply 2 friends remembering a version of themselves that existed before every moment became something the world could watch. Then Jimin's smile faded. "Do you think we're still allowed to be ordinary?" Suga looked at him. "Of course. Even now, especially now." Jimin nodded slowly. "I think I forgot." Suga looked toward the door. "Then remember." Silence returned. This time it felt peaceful. Eventually, Jimin leaned back and closed his eyes. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. If I ever tell you I'm fine and you know I'm not." Suga waited. "What should you do?" Suga answered without hesitation. "Ask again." Jimin smiled. "And if I say I'm fine again, ask again." Jimin laughed quietly. "What if I get annoyed? I'll survive. What if I tell you to leave me alone?" Suga thought for a moment. "I'll give you space." Jimin opened his eyes. "Really?" "Yes," Suga paused, "but I'll stay close enough that you know I'm still there." Jimin stared at him. For a moment, neither moved. Then Jimin reached over and lightly tapped Suga's hand with his fingers. It was a small gesture, almost childlike, but Suga understood. "Thank you," Jimin whispered. "For what?" "For staying." Suga looked down at their hands. "You don't have to thank me for that." Outside, rain began tapping against the window. The city lights blurred across the glass. Somewhere far below, fans were still leaving the venue, carrying memories of the concert they believed had ended perfectly. They didn't know what had happened behind the curtain. They didn't know about Minnie, the message, the fear, or the quiet conversation between two friends in a nearly empty room. And perhaps they didn't need to. Some moments were never meant for the spotlight. Some acts of kindness mattered precisely because nobody was watching. Jimin eventually fell asleep on the sofa. Suga remained seated nearby, occasionally glancing toward him to make sure he was comfortable. He didn't touch his phone. He didn't check social media. He simply stayed. About 20 minutes later, Jimin woke briefly. "Suga, yeah, are you still here? I told you I would be." Jimin nodded, closed his eyes again, and whispered something barely audible. "Then I can sleep." Suga looked at him and smiled faintly. "Yeah." And for the first time that night, Jimin slept without worrying about whether anyone else was okay. Morning arrived quietly, almost as if the city itself had decided not to disturb them. Pale sunlight slipped through the curtains of the private recovery room, falling across the chair where Suga had spent most of the night. The arena that had been filled with thousands of voices only hours earlier now felt impossibly distant. Jimin slowly opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling, trying to remember where he was. Then he noticed Suga asleep in the chair beside him, his arms folded loosely across his chest, his head tilted slightly to one side. For several seconds, Jimin simply watched him. He remembered the previous night in fragments, the stage lights, the final song, Minnie's message, the dizziness, Suga's voice calling his name. But one memory remained clearer than all the others. "I told you I would stay." Jimin smiled faintly. He reached for the bottle of water on the table, but before he could lift it, Suga opened his eyes. "You're awake." "You were pretending to sleep," Jimin asked. "No," Suga sat up slowly. "I was actually sleeping badly." Jimin laughed softly. "Thank you, don't start." "I'm serious." Suga looked at him. "I know." Before they could say anything else, the door opened. RM entered quietly, followed by Jin, J-Hope, Jungkook, and V. They didn't bring cameras, phones, or the usual energy that followed them backstage. They simply came in as friends. Jungkook approached first. "How are you feeling?" "Better." Jungkook looked at Suga. "Did he sleep?" Suga answered immediately. "Barely." "I knew it." Jin placed a small paper bag on the table. "Breakfast." Jimin looked inside. "You brought this." "Of course, you think we're going to let you survive on bottled water." J-Hope smiled. "He's been worried since last night." Jin pointed at him. "You were worried too." "I didn't say I wasn't." The room slowly filled with warmth. It wasn't loud. Nobody wanted to turn the moment into something dramatic, but their presence changed the atmosphere. Jimin looked around at the members and suddenly felt the weight of the previous night returning, not as fear this time, but as gratitude. "I'm sorry," he said. Jin immediately shook his head. "No." Jimin looked confused. "But no apologizing before breakfast." J-Hope laughed. "That's a new rule." Everyone smiled. But then RM's expression became serious. "There's something else." Jimin looked at him. "Minnie's mother is stable." Jimin exhaled in relief. "And Minnie, he's at the hospital with his family." Jimin nodded. "Did he sleep?" RM smiled slightly. "Probably not." Jimin lowered his eyes. "I want to see him." Suga looked at him. "Only if the doctor says you're okay." Jimin nodded. This time, he didn't argue. Several hours later, after being cleared to leave the venue, Jimin and Suga traveled separately from the rest of the group to a small hospital across the city. They didn't go as celebrities. They went quietly, accompanied by one manager and a staff member who had already coordinated with Minnie's family. The rain from the previous night had stopped, leaving the streets washed clean. Cars moved slowly through the morning traffic. Jimin sat by the window, watching ordinary people hurry to work. For several minutes, neither he nor Suga spoke. Then Jimin said, "I'm nervous." "About what?" "Seeing him." Suga glanced at him. "Why?" "Because I don't know what to say." "Then don't prepare a speech." Jimin smiled. "That's your advice?" "Yes." "Very profound." "I know." Jimin laughed. When they arrived, Minnie was sitting in a hospital corridor beside a vending machine. He looked exhausted. The moment he saw Jimin, he stood quickly. "You shouldn't have come." Jimin smiled. "I know. You need to rest." "I did." "You collapsed." "I know." Minnie looked at Suga. "You brought him anyway." Suga raised an eyebrow. "He brought himself." Jimin smiled. The tension slowly disappeared. Minnie looked down at the floor. "My mother is awake." "That's good." "She asked me if I was still playing tonight." Jimin smiled. "What did you say?" "I told her I didn't know." Jimin sat beside him. "That's okay." Minnie looked at him. "I still think I should quit." Jimin didn't immediately tell him not to. Instead, he asked, "Why?" Minnie took a deep breath. "Because my family needs me. I can't chase a dream while they're struggling." Jimin nodded. "Then don't chase it the same way." Minnie frowned. "What does that mean?" "Maybe music doesn't have to be your only income. Maybe you work somewhere else for a while. Maybe you perform less. Maybe you study. Maybe you take a break. But don't decide that your dream is dead just because the road changed." Minnie stared at him. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't." Jimin looked toward the hospital room. "That's why I'm not telling you what to choose." Suga watched silently. He knew Jimin had learned something overnight. He wasn't trying to rescue Minnie anymore. He was simply giving him room to choose. Minnie's eyes filled with tears. "Yesterday I thought nobody would notice." Jimin shook his head. "I noticed." "Why?" "Because you stayed after rehearsal when everyone else left." Minnie looked confused. Jimin continued. "You helped one of the older musicians carry equipment even though nobody asked you to. You gave your water to another performer. You kept telling everyone else they were doing well. People notice more than you think." Minnie wiped his face. "I thought that was nothing." "It wasn't nothing." Suga finally spoke. "Sometimes the smallest things tell you who a person really is." Minnie looked at him. "Then what should I do now?" Suga answered. "Go inside and see your mother." Minnie nodded. He stood, but before walking away, he turned back toward Jimin. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When you collapsed, were you scared?" Jimin paused. He could have said no. He could have smiled and made it easier. But he remembered what Suga had told him. He didn't need to be strong every second. "Yes," Jimin admitted. "I was." Minnie looked surprised. Jimin continued. "I was scared that everyone would think I was weak." Suga looked at him, knowing exactly what Jimin was doing. He was telling the truth not only for himself, but for someone who needed to hear it. "But then I realized something," Jimin said. "Being scared doesn't mean you're weak, it means something matters to you." Minnie nodded slowly. "Thank you," Jimin smiled. "Go see your mother." Minnie walked into the room. Jimin watched through the glass for a moment, then he turned toward Suga. "I think that's enough." Suga nodded. "Yeah." They began walking back toward the elevator. Halfway down the corridor, Jimin stopped. "Suga." "What?" "Last night when I fell," he hesitated. "I heard you calling my name." Suga looked at him. "You remember, not everything." Jimin lowered his voice. "But I remember your voice." Suga looked away. "Good. Were you crying?" Suga's eyes widened slightly. "No," Jimin smiled. "You were." "I wasn't." "You were." Suga sighed. "Maybe." Jimin's smile disappeared. "I'm sorry." Suga shook his head. "Stop saying that." "But Jimin," he stepped closer. "Do you know what I thought when you collapsed?" Jimin shook his head. Suga took a breath. "I thought I should have noticed sooner." Jimin's expression softened. "You did notice. Not enough. You asked me. And you lied." Jimin looked down. "I didn't want you to worry." Suga's voice became quieter. "That's what hurt." Jimin looked up. Suga continued. "Not because you scared me, because you thought you had to protect me from the truth." Jimin's eyes filled with tears again. "I didn't know how to say I wasn't okay." Suga nodded. "Then next time don't explain, just say I'm not okay. That's enough." Jimin stood silently. Then, without saying anything, he stepped forward and hugged Suga. It wasn't dramatic. There were no cameras, no crowd, just two friends standing in a quiet hospital corridor while nurses moved around them. Suga hesitated for half a second before wrapping his arms around him. Jimin whispered, "Thank you for staying." Suga answered quietly, "Always." When they separated, Jimin wiped his eyes and smiled. But then a hospital volunteer approached them. She was an older woman named Mrs. Han who had been sitting near the reception desk. She had watched the entire exchange from a distance. "Excuse me," she said softly. Jimin turned toward her. "Yes," she smiled. I don't know who you are to that young man, but I hope you understand what you just gave him. Jimin looked confused. Mrs. Han continued, my son was a musician too. He stopped playing because he thought struggling meant he wasn't good enough. He never started again. She paused. Seeing you sit beside that boy reminded me of him. Jimin's expression changed. He didn't know what to say. Mrs. Han looked at Suga. And seeing you stay beside him reminded me of something else. Suga waited. Sometimes people don't need someone to solve their problems. They need someone who refuses to leave while they are facing them. Neither Jimin nor Suga answered immediately. The words stayed with them as they walked toward the elevator. Behind them, Minyi remained with his mother. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about whether he was successful. He was simply thinking about tomorrow. And perhaps that was enough. When the elevator doors opened, Jimin stepped inside, but before the doors closed, he looked back at the hospital corridor. Nothing about the moment would appear on a stage. There would be no cheering crowd, no spectacular lights, no perfect choreography. Yet somehow Jimin felt that this quiet morning had become more important than any performance the night before. Suga stood beside him as the elevator descended. You okay? He asked. Jimin smiled. I'm not completely okay. Suga nodded. Good. Jimin looked at him. Good. Because now you're telling me the truth. Jimin laughed softly. And for the first time since the collapse, neither of them was pretending that everything was fine. They simply knew that whatever came next, they wouldn't have to face it alone. By the time Jimin and Suga returned to the hotel, the story of what had happened backstage had already begun to spread in fragments. A few staff members knew Jimin had needed medical attention. Someone had noticed the sudden movement around the dressing room. Another person had seen Suga running toward him. But nobody outside the inner circle knew the full story, and the members agreed that it should remain private. There was no reason for Minyi's family situation to become public, and there was certainly no reason for Jimin's vulnerable moment to become entertainment. Still, the night had changed something inside the group. The usual schedule continued, but the atmosphere was different. Jimin was told to rest, drink more water, and avoid unnecessary activity. For once, he followed every instruction without trying to negotiate. Suga noticed that immediately. You're actually listening, he said as they walked through the quiet hotel corridor. Jimin smiled. I'm learning. Slowly, very slowly. Behind them, Jungkook laughed. At least he's learning. Jimin turned around. Why are you all following me? Jin answered from behind him, because apparently leaving you alone is no longer an option. J-Hope smiled. We're just making sure you don't suddenly decide to rehearse in the hallway. I wouldn't do that. Everyone looked at him. Jimin raised both hands. Okay, maybe I would. The laughter that followed felt different from the laughter on stage. It wasn't performed. It wasn't part of a schedule. It was the kind of laughter that came after fear, when people realized someone they cared about was safe enough to joke again. But the emotional aftermath wasn't limited to the members. The people who had witnessed the previous night's events carried their own memories. One backstage technician later admitted that he had never seen the room become so quiet. A security guard who had been stationed near the dressing area said the moment stayed with him because nobody cared about appearances once Jimin fell. The first priority had been making sure he was okay. That simplicity affected people more than they expected. Meanwhile, Minyi remained at the hospital with his mother. By the next afternoon, her condition had improved enough for doctors to allow her to rest at home. Minyi still hadn't made a final decision about music. Instead, he had done something smaller and perhaps more important. He had called the place where he had been offered a full-time job and asked whether they could give him a few days to think. It wasn't a dramatic victory. Nothing about his circumstances had magically changed. His family's financial concerns remained. His responsibilities remained. But he had stopped making decisions from panic. That was the first difference. When Jimin heard the news, he smiled. That's enough. Suga looked at him. Enough for what? For now, Suga nodded. Exactly. Later that week, Minyi returned to the rehearsal facility to collect his instrument. He expected the place to feel awkward, but something surprised him. A small note had been taped to the inside of his instrument case. It wasn't signed. It simply said, "Take your time." Minyi knew immediately who had left it. He didn't tell anyone. He simply folded the note carefully and placed it inside the case. Across the city, Jimin had returned to practice, but he approached the room differently. He no longer tried to hide every moment of fatigue. When he needed a break, he said so. When something felt wrong, he spoke. The first time he stopped rehearsal early, the room became quiet. Jimin looked around and laughed nervously. What? J-Hope smiled. Nothing, we're just proud of you. Jimin shook his head. Don't make it weird. Too late, Jungkook said. Everyone laughed. Suga watched from the side without saying anything. He didn't need to. The change was visible. Jimin was still hardworking, still demanding of himself, still the person who would stay behind to perfect a small movement nobody else had noticed. But now, he understood that discipline didn't have to mean ignoring his limits. The members began quietly changing their own habits too. RM started asking everyone to check in before long rehearsals. Jin made sure meals weren't skipped simply because the schedule was busy. J-Hope became even more attentive to the atmosphere in the practice room. Jungkook started noticing when someone became unusually quiet. V began leaving small reminders for the staff to take breaks during long production days. None of these changes were announced. There was no meeting where they declared that everything would be different from then on. It happened naturally because one difficult night had reminded everyone how easily people could hide pain behind routine. Weeks passed. Jimin became physically stronger again. The fear surrounding the collapse faded, but the memory didn't disappear. Sometimes, during quiet moments, he would remember the sound of the bottle hitting the floor. Sometimes he remembered Suga's voice. Sometimes he remembered Minnie's message. But instead of feeling guilty, he began to see the night differently. It hadn't been a failure. Been a warning. One evening, Jimin received a message from Minnie. I decided not to quit completely. Jimin stared at the screen for several seconds before smiling. Another message appeared. I'm working part-time during the week and practicing on weekends. It's harder, but I think I can do it. Jimin showed the message to Suga. Suga read it and nodded. That's good. That's all you're going to say? What do you want me to say? Something emotional. No, Jimin laughed. You're impossible. Suga smiled. He made his own decision, that's what matters. Jimin nodded. You're right. Then another message appeared. This time it was a photo. Minnie had taken a picture of his instrument sitting beside his mother's hospital discharge papers. There was no caption. Jimin understood anyway. He looked at the photo for a long time. He kept both, Jimin whispered. Suga glanced at the screen. His responsibility and his dream. Jimin smiled. Maybe they don't always have to fight each other. Maybe. That evening, Jimin saved the photo. Not because it was proof that he had helped someone, but because it reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten about himself. People rarely changed because someone gave them perfect answers. More often, they changed because someone gave them enough space to believe they could find their own answer. And perhaps that was the most important lesson from the night in the dressing room. Jimin had wanted to save Minnie. Suga had wanted to protect Jimin. The other members had wanted to protect them both, but none of them could control the future. All they could do was remain present. Months later, the concert venue looked completely different when they returned for another performance. The same corridors were there, the same dressing rooms, the same backstage mirrors, yet Jimin paused outside the room where he had collapsed. Suga noticed. You okay? Jimin looked at the door. Yeah, he smiled. Just remembering. Suga stood beside him. Do you want to go in? Jimin thought about it. Not yet. Suga nodded. They continued walking. A few minutes later, they heard music coming from one of the rehearsal rooms. Jimin stopped. Through the slightly open door, a young musician was practicing the same melody Minnie had once played during rehearsals. Jimin smiled. He didn't enter. He simply listened for a few seconds before walking away. Suga glanced at him. What? Jimin said. Nothing. You're smiling. I know. The sound followed them down the hallway. It wasn't perfect. There were missed notes. There were pauses, but it was still music. And somehow that was enough. Later that night, before the concert began, Jimin stood backstage while thousands of fans waited beyond the curtain. The lights from the audience shimmered through the gap. He took a slow breath. Suga stood beside him. Ready? He asked. Jimin nodded. Yeah. Then he looked at Suga and added, but if I say I'm not okay, Suga immediately answered, I'll ask again. Jimin smiled. Good. The stage lights came up. The crowd erupted. Jimin stepped forward. This time, however, he didn't carry the weight of proving that he could endure everything. He simply walked onto the stage as himself. And somewhere in the audience, among thousands of people who knew nothing about the private story behind that night, a young musician named Minnie watched the performance from his seat, his instrument case resting beside him. He had bought the ticket with money he had saved from his first few weeks of work. He wasn't there because Jimin had rescued him. He was there because he had decided to keep going. When Jimin appeared beneath the lights, Minnie stood with everyone else. And for a brief second, Jimin looked toward the crowd without knowing exactly where he was. He simply smiled. Perhaps some stories don't need the people involved to recognize each other from a distance. Perhaps it is enough that both of them understand what the moment means. One had learned that asking for help wasn't weakness. The other had learned that helping someone didn't mean carrying their entire life. And Suga, standing beside Jimin beneath the stage lights, knew that the night Jimin collapsed had left something behind. Not fear, not guilt, but a quiet promise that none of them would mistake silence for strength ever again. Months passed, and the night in the dressing room slowly became something the outside world never fully understood. To most people, it was simply a night when Jimin had become exhausted after a concert. There were no dramatic headlines revealing what had actually happened, no public explanation of the private conversations that followed, and no attempt from the members to turn a vulnerable moment into a story. But inside their small circle, the memory remained. It changed little things first. Jimin became more willing to say when he needed a break. Suga became even more attentive to the silence between Jimin's words. The other members learned to recognize when a simple question, "Are you okay?" needed to be asked twice. And Minnie's life began moving in a direction nobody could have predicted that night. He continued working during the week while practicing music whenever he could. It wasn't easy. There were days when he came home exhausted and wondered whether he had made the right choice. There were moments when financial pressure returned, when his family needed something unexpected, when the dream he had once loved began feeling like another responsibility. But he didn't disappear from music. He started playing small local performances again. Sometimes only a handful of people listened. Sometimes nobody knew his name. He learned to accept that progress could be quiet. One afternoon, several months after the concert, Minnie sent Jimin a short recording of himself playing. There were mistakes in it. The timing wasn't perfect. The sound quality was ordinary, but Jimin listened to the entire recording without skipping once. Then he sent a simple message. "You kept going." Minnie replied, "You told me to give myself one more day." Jimin smiled at the screen. "Looks like you took several." The response came almost immediately. "I'm glad I did." Jimin showed Suga the conversation. Suga nodded. "That's his story now." "I know. Don't make it yours." Jimin looked at him and smiled. "I'm trying." That had become one of the quiet jokes between them. Jimin was learning to care without taking ownership of someone else's life. Suga was learning that protecting a friend didn't mean controlling every decision. They had both changed, though neither would have described it that way. One evening, during another long rehearsal, Jimin noticed a young crew member sitting alone near the equipment cases. The young man looked exhausted and kept staring at his phone. Jimin recognized the expression immediately. He didn't rush over. He didn't ask a dozen questions. He simply walked past, placed a bottle of water beside him, and said, "Take 5 minutes." The crew member looked up. "But we're behind schedule." Jimin smiled. 5 minutes won't destroy the world." Then he walked away. Suga had seen the exchange from across the room. When Jimin returned, Suga raised an eyebrow. "You're getting better." Jimin smiled. "At what?" "Knowing when to help without trying to fix everything." Jimin laughed. "You sound proud. Don't ruin it." Their conversation ended there, but the lesson remained. The experience also changed the way Jimin understood his relationship with fans. During later performances, he began noticing things he might once have overlooked. A fan holding a handwritten sign about returning to school, someone crying during a song, a young performer in the audience watching the stage with the same uncertain expression Minnie once carried. He couldn't personally solve every person's struggle. He couldn't know every story, but he could acknowledge that they existed. Sometimes a smile was enough, sometimes a wave. Sometimes simply making eye contact with someone who had spent years feeling invisible could become a memory they carried home. Jimin never pretended that a few seconds on stage could change someone's life completely. He understood the limits of those moments. But he also understood that small moments could matter without becoming miracles. That distinction became important to him. Meanwhile, Suga carried his own private lesson from the night. He had always believed that caring for someone meant being prepared to step in when things went wrong. But that night taught him something more difficult. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is remain close without taking away their ability to make their own choices. It was a lesson he practiced quietly. When Jimin said he was tired, Suga didn't immediately tell him what to do. He asked what he needed. When Jimin became quiet, Suga didn't force him to talk. He simply stayed nearby. Their friendship became less about constant words and more about understanding when words weren't necessary. One night after rehearsal, they sat alone in a studio while rain tapped against the windows. Jimin was looking through old photos on his phone. He stopped at one from the concert where everything had changed. "Do you remember this night?" he asked. Suga looked at the screen. "Of course. Sometimes I wish I could go back and tell myself something." "What?" Jimin thought for a moment. "That I don't have to wait until I collapse before admitting I'm tired." Suga nodded. "That's a good one." Jimin looked at him. "What would you tell yourself?" Suga stared at the photograph for several seconds. "That asking someone to stay isn't a burden." Jimin became quiet. He understood exactly what Suga meant. The rain continued outside. Neither of them spoke for a while, then Jimin placed the phone face down on the table. "We really were bad at that." Suga smiled. "We still are." "Maybe." Jimin looked toward the studio window. "But we're better." "That's enough." The story of that night also reached places neither of them expected. A backstage worker who had witnessed the incident later started encouraging other crew members to take proper breaks during long schedules. A young dancer who had heard about Jimin's conversation with Minnie began checking on his classmates more often. Even Minnie's mother, after recovering, began encouraging her son not to see responsibility and passion as enemies. None of these changes were dramatic enough to become headlines, but that was exactly why they mattered. Real change rarely arrived with applause. It appeared in ordinary decisions repeated over time. Someone taking a break instead of pushing through. Someone asking for help instead of disappearing. Someone listening instead of immediately giving advice. Someone staying. Months later, Minnie performed at a small community event. There were fewer than 100 people in the audience. His mother sat near the front. His younger sister held up a handmade sign with his name on it. Before he walked onto the stage, Minnie received a message from Jimin. "Good luck, don't worry about being perfect." Minnie smiled. Then another message appeared from Suga. "Play the song, that's all." Minnie laughed. He put the phone away and stepped onto the stage. His hands were shaking at first. The first note wasn't perfect. The second was better. By the third, he had stopped thinking about whether he belonged there. He was simply playing. Afterward, his mother hugged him. "You look happy," she said. Minnie smiled. "I am." "Then keep going." He looked at her. "Even if it gets difficult," she nodded. "Especially then, but remember, you don't have to do it alone." Those words echoed something he had heard months earlier in a hospital corridor. Different voice. Different place. Same truth. And perhaps that was the legacy of the night Jimin collapsed. Not that one famous person saved one struggling musician, because that would have made the story far simpler than it really was. The truth was that several people learned how to notice one another. Jimin learned to admit when he needed support. Suga learned that staying could be more powerful than solving. Minnie learned that changing direction did not mean abandoning his dream. The members learned to pay attention not only to performances, but to the people performing them. And the people around them learned that kindness didn't require a spotlight. 1 year after the concert, Jimin returned to the same venue. He stood backstage for a moment before the show, looking at the familiar corridor. The dressing room door was still there. The same kind of lights reflected against the mirrors. The same faint smell of stage makeup and equipment filled the air. He placed his hand against the door handle but didn't open it immediately. Suga appeared beside him. "You remembering again?" Jimin smiled. "Maybe." "You want to go in?" Jimin shook his head. "Not today," Suga nodded. They stood together in silence. From the arena came the distant sound of thousands of fans beginning to cheer. Jimin looked toward the stage entrance. "You know what I remember most?" Suga asked. "The collapse." Jimin shook his head. "No, after." "What happened after?" Jimin smiled softly. "When I woke up and realized you were still there." Suga looked away. "I told you I would stay." "I know." Jimin took a breath. "That's the part I don't want to forget." The stage manager called for them. The moment was over. Jimin adjusted his jacket and took one final look at the corridor before walking toward the lights. Suga followed beside him. The past remained behind that door, but it no longer controlled them. It had become something else, a reminder that even people who appear strong can become tired, even people who seem successful can feel lost, and even the smallest act of staying can become meaningful long after the moment has passed. As Jimin stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted. He smiled. This time, the smile required no effort. It wasn't hiding anything. It was simply happiness. And beside him stood Suga, exactly where he had promised to be. A year later, The memory of that night no longer felt like a wound. It had become something quieter, a reminder that strength was never measured by how long someone could pretend to be fine. Jimin sometimes thought about the moment the bottle slipped from his hand, the sudden silence in the dressing room, and Suga's voice calling his name through the panic. But whenever he remembered it now, he no longer focused on the fear. He remembered what came afterward, people staying, listening, waiting, and allowing one another to be human. Minnie continued building his life one decision at a time. His family was still not wealthy. Music had not magically solved every problem. There were still difficult weeks and uncertain plans, but he was no longer ashamed of changing direction when life demanded it. He played smaller stages, worked when he needed to, and kept his instrument close. His dream had stopped being something he had to protect at all costs. It had become something he could carry differently. And perhaps that was the real lesson. Dreams do not always survive because we hold on to them exactly as they were. Sometimes they survive because we are willing to reshape them. Suga learned something too. He learned that loving a friend did not mean preventing every painful moment. It meant being there when the painful moment arrived. It meant asking twice when the first answer didn't sound right. It meant knowing when to speak and when silence was enough. And Jimin learned that accepting help didn't make him less strong. It made him honest. On another evening, long after another concert had ended, Jimin and Suga walked through a quiet backstage corridor. There were no emergencies this time. No medical staff. No fallen water bottle. Just the fading sound of an audience leaving the building. Jimin stopped near the dressing room door and smiled. "Do you remember what you said that night?" Suga looked at him. "Which part? You told me I didn't owe anyone a performance when the stage was gone." Suga nodded. "I still mean it." Jimin looked toward the empty hallway. "I think everyone needs to hear that sometimes." Suga smiled faintly. "Then tell them." Jimin thought about it. Maybe he would, not as a speech, not as a lesson, perhaps simply by continuing to live differently. By resting when he needed to rest, by asking for help when he couldn't carry something alone, by reminding the people around him that being human was not something they had to apologize for. The lights above them slowly switched off one section at a time. The venue was returning to darkness, but this time there was nothing frightening about it. Jimin looked at Suga. "Ready to go?" "Yeah." They began walking. Behind them, the dressing room door remained closed. The place where everything had changed was becoming just another room again. But the meaning of that night would remain with them. Not because it was dramatic. Not because someone had collapsed and everyone had been afraid. It mattered because, in the middle of all that noise, several people had chosen to notice one another. And perhaps that is what empathy really looks like, not rescuing everyone, not having perfect answers, and not pretending that pain can disappear because someone says the right words. Sometimes empathy is simply recognizing that another person is struggling and refusing to look away. Sometimes friendship is not the grand gesture people remember. It is the quiet chair beside the bed, the bottle of water left on a table, the message that says, "Take your time." The question asked one more time, "Are you really okay?" And sometimes healing begins with the simplest answer, "No, I'm not." Then someone stays. They don't fix everything. They don't promise that tomorrow will be easy. They simply stay long enough for the person beside them to believe that tomorrow is worth reaching. That night, Jimin had thought he was protecting everyone by hiding his exhaustion. Minnie had thought he was protecting his family by abandoning the dream he loved. Suga had thought he needed to be strong enough to prevent Jimin from ever falling. All three discovered something different. People cannot always be protected from pain. Dreams cannot always be protected from change. And friendship cannot always prevent someone from falling. But when someone falls, they don't have to fall alone. The final lights disappeared behind them as Jimin and Suga walked toward the exit. Outside, the night air was cool, and somewhere beyond the venue, the city continued moving as though nothing unusual had happened. People went home. Cars passed. Lights flickered in apartment windows. Somewhere, Minnie was probably practicing the same melody that had once made him believe he had to choose between responsibility and his dream. Somewhere else, someone who had never heard this story was probably struggling silently, wondering whether anyone would notice. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But the possibility remained that one person might ask the right question at the right time. One person might stay. One person might say, "You don't have to handle this alone." And perhaps that is why the night Jimin collapsed was never really about the moment he fell. It was about what happened when everyone stopped pretending that being strong meant standing alone. Suga stayed. Jimin finally let someone stay. Minnie chose to keep moving forward, even if the road looked different. And in the end, none of them walked away unchanged. So if you ever find yourself watching someone smile and wondering whether they're truly okay, maybe ask again. And if someone you love finally admits that they're not okay, don't rush to give them an answer. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is simply, "I'm here." Because there are moments when a person doesn't need to be saved. They only need to know that someone will not leave while they find their way back to themselves. And if you were standing in that dressing room that night, watching Jimin collapse while Suga held his hand, would you have recognized the warning signs sooner? Or would you have made the same mistake they all made by believing that someone who looked strong must be okay?